Day, everyone. Topic of today's lecture is what is fantasy today? Or was ist Kunst? Um, versus Tolkien and the classics. So I have this book, the illustrated Ellen Lee. I have this book, the original Hobbit with jacket illustration. These are Tolkien's own drawings, and I have the Book of the Lost Tales. Was is the conclusions? I'm missing the pipe. I should make a terracotta orange clay pipe so I can go like this. Okay. Enough with the comedy routine. What is the point of this video? Um, well, as many of you may have noticed who are not millennial or Generation Y readers, that you began reading in the 90s or earlier, that there has been, of course, shifts over time, um, but that there has been, in my opinion, a great shift recently in the style of fantasy and in the to some extent we're talking about, if you're talking about Western European fantasy, which is what most people mean, there are a few different currents, but the current that is there are a few different currents. So there is the sword and sorcery current. The current I will call sword and sorcery a heroic fantasy, which would be like Conan the Barbarian, etc. Usually with a heroic protagonist, um, rugged individual, usually. Then you have J R R Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is um, world-changing event. Involves seemingly unlikely individual, all sorts of philosophical implications. And these wove back and forth. In the 90s, we had many different fantasy writers. You know, Dragonlance, Tad Williams, etc. Many of which I read when I was younger. Um, Now, what are the big names we see, especially since Game of Thrones has become so popular as a TV show? Now we're seeing the names that are big in book sales or as authors. We see Patrick Rothfuss, we see Brandon Sanderson, we see George Martin, which everybody is waiting books for from two of them. Nobody is waiting for books from Brandon Sanderson. I will not comment on this infrequency of writing in this video. Um, but we'll stick to the point of the video, which is that what is the essential difference between this fantasy, which is being produced, and the experience that I get when I read The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or this? What is the difference? Well, I can tell you one thing that's a huge difference for me. Now, everybody may have a different experience, and probably will. The spiritual experience that I get from reading Tolkien and being carried away by his narrative and his world, and sort of the warmth of it. There's not only, and not so much of the blood and gore has entered it yet, but there is darkness, but there is also light, but there is sort of warmth of familiar things as well. And the humble and the proud are both represented. And this is a very Christian sounding theme that I'm sure he was aware of, but I'm not talking about the ties to religion or his religious implications for his book. Though probably that most certainly had an influence on it. I am talking about the experience of it seems spiritual in some way. It seems like when he writes, it's very engrossing, it's very easy to read. Now, if we pick up one of these newer writers, now I grew up reading Dragonlance. We won't go into big depth into Dragonlance, but as a kid, I liked those books. I think maybe I was hungry for something else, but I didn't think there was ever going to be anything else since it was so popular. much to my much was counter to what happened. But these new authors that have come to rise, like Brandon Sanderson, or I mean, I don't want to show any of their books on here because it's going to be like I'm being critical and pointing fingers. I don't think in general I get the same experience from them. I never have. And I also see people included like Rothfuss who go on conferences and they say things about Tolkien, specifically about the maps and how he just included a map in The Hobbit because there's a map in the map in the story, and he also only invented languages because he was a language geek. Is something that Rothfuss said at a conference. Well, I can tell what he also said in the same in one video. I think it was the same video. Rothfuss also said, now this is from somebody who I think should be a professional and know their field, who we are putting on a pedestal. Thousands, if not a million, people are reading a book. And we're saying this should be an example. And that, I mean, I assume that somebody should really know their field, right? So he says that there's only a map in The Hobbit because there's a map in the story. Well, that is not true because the first map that's in The Hobbit is the map that's in the story. Okay. But there is another map, and I have known this since I was a little kid. This map, this other map, is a map of Wilderland, the Misty Mountains, and it shows Elrond and Rivendell, and Mirkwood, and the Lonely Mountain, and where everything is. Anybody who has got this book, anybody who has The Hobbit, can see that there are two maps in it. And he makes it seem like in a conference, there's only one map. Now, I think it's in the same interview. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong, but he also says about Tolkien that you couldn't have a sequel to The Lord of the Rings because what it would be, the Shire 2, Shire Harda, and Tolkien himself, he must not know anything about Tolkien very in depth because, I mean, if he gets the fact that there's not two maps in Hobbit wrong, it's ridiculous. But there was a sequel to The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien abandoned because he said it would just be a thriller. And it was kind of like his own opinion of why he should write a book and such, so it's somewhat complicated, but I'm sure all the fans of his writing would have loved to read it, and many are disappointed that he did not finish it. But he had his own very particular views on most things, so I think that, he didn't do it. But he did 13 pages of it, and from 13 pages, I think that The New Shadow, it was called, would be a perfectly viable story. Now, to get to the other point that Rothfuss says, and I have no reason to pick on him, but I'm just going through examples that are fresh in my head about new writers and what they actually know. What do they actually know about their field? And what are they saying authoritatively to crowds at conventions? Like, okay, so he also says Tolkien he said a couple things, but he said Tolkien just invented languages because he was a language geek. Well, it is true when he was a kid, they played this game. And I can't cite sources for this, but this is what I've read somewhere or whatnot or heard it. He invented languages as a game when he was a little kid, and when he got older, he continued this, and as he started enjoying learning different languages, he was a language scholar, so he could make his languages more realistic. The reason why I don't understand what Rothfuss is saying at all. Do you? Do you think that you don't have to make up a language for each society in your book? You think it's silly that you have to make up a new language for each society in your book? My question is how is that realistic? It's not realistic at all. You think that you make up an entire world that is not our world, that does not have our countries, that has different religion, society, and then they all speak English. I mean, is this just, it's almost like a cover for saying, I'm too lazy and I don't want to learn linguistics. So, and if I don't, for some reason, want to do that, which personally I can't understand because I've always been fascinated with the topic. But if you really didn't want to do that, and I mean, it just shows me that you're a popular writer and you're just in it for writing popular fiction, you're just in it for commercialist reasons. That's what it says to me, really. But if you really couldn't do it or wouldn't do it or don't want to do it, you can get somebody who does know them. Like me, for example. You could hire somebody like me to do it. I've made up languages and I know many foreign languages, and I'm a scholar of linguistics and classical languages. I know all sorts of them. I have a degree in classics. You just hire somebody like me to do it. I'm sure there's some of us that need some extra money or a job. See, this is what I mean. Is like how can I take that seriously? How can we take that seriously when people are like that? It seems to me exploitive of the field. It seems to me like an act of exploitation is happening. You know, people don't want to take the time to make a finely crafted art form, so they are saying, why do we need to do that? Remember, Rothfuss was also saying, I just want to quickly address before the end of this video, though, because I've made my point, is that I want to quickly address what another thing that he said, which is that why should we have a map in our fantasies? And why should we have a map and why should we make up languages for our fantasy world? And I mean, there's no reason to single him out. I'm just taking an example. I'm just taking examples that are fresh in my mind. I could talk about other people. He's not the only one who has said things that I find shallow and questionable, and like, why is this person saying it? And moreover, it shows me that he does not know J R R Tolkien, and that he's being asked authoritatively about it, and he's not representing it, not representing it well. He's misrepresenting it. He's giving information that isn't even right. Okay, I can come up with other examples. He's just fresh in my mind, so we're using him. But this is a good example, though. This is one good example, though. Is why should we make up a language? I think we addressed why we should make up languages for our book, because our world needs to seem real. It needs to have authenticity. Do you see what I'm saying? And if it takes extra work, and if it takes mind power, if it takes consulting experts, takes research, then we should do that. Okay? So I answered that question. The other point he makes is, why should we make a map for our books? And if we were making a map for our books just because Tolkien did it, then it's wrong. Well, I don't know what he's talking about, because the whole point of doing a fantasy like this one and not doing, say, a fairy tale or something which doesn't have a, yeah, just it doesn't rely on geographical detail and a fully created, what Tolkien called a secondary world. It doesn't fully create this imaginary world. The whole point of that is, there's sort of fairy tales where we don't know what the country looks like that they're inhabiting. Could be anywhere. Usually it's a country that already just exists in our world. Or there's making up your own imaginary world. You make the imaginary world seem more real by having a map. So it seems more real for the reader. Because landscapes are real. It's not just what George Martin said in response to this, because George R. R. Martin was on the same panel. He said in response, "So people will know where things are." Well, yes, that's right. That's another way of saying what I am saying. But I mean, the real reason is that this world now seems 20 times more real. That's why it caught on as a fad too. Before Tolkien, people didn't have maps in their books. And he obviously liked maps because he spent all this artistic time and detail on making the map. And he hand drew these maps and they're works of art. Okay. He also illustrated all of his own books. Okay. So he was a guy who would make up languages, illustrate all his old books. He had the know how to make up realistic languages because he was a scholar. He was a scholar of myth. He could give this myth an imagination. And now, like, we're getting books where there isn't even a painting on the cover, or people are saying, well, why do you have to make up a language for your book? Just because Tolkien did it? It's nonsense. Absolute hogwash. Hogwash. Your world, you want your world to seem real. And what is a real world? It has its own language, it has its own landscape. No, you don't have to do anything, I guess. But if you are interested in getting people to imagine to live in your world, I mean, this is the goal: is to get people to be able to live in your world, bring the world alive for them, fully alive. That's your goal. Why not make a map? Why not do drawings of your world? Now, some people don't have the talent of art. I understand that. There's millions of artists out there. They can hire it. And we'll have to go into the quality of art nowadays because I think that really demands another critical video. But look at this. No, I mean, I want to say, I'm putting Tolkien on a pedestal, and I don't even want to do that. But I mean, compared to what's being done now, he is on a pedestal. Okay, I mean, it's a de facto pedestal or technical pedestal, you know, like technical knockout. Okay, like you know, like look at this. Look at the beauty of this. Where's the beauty in stuff being done now? I don't see. I mean, I don't see it. I mean, I don't want to insult people. I don't want to put them down. Obviously, this is going to sound like that. There are qualities of their book, perhaps I do like, that are not in Tolkien. Maybe. But I mean, like, as a whole package, as an entire package. I mean, I can do better. I am doing better. I have done better. I've written books that are better than this. You know, it's like there's a story about Robert Jordan where he was in bed sick and he was reading because it's the only thing he could do. And he decided to become an author because he was reading a book and he threw it against the wall and he said, I can do better than this. And we'll have to review Jordan another time because I'm not putting him. I mean, don't think that I'm putting Jordan because of that story in this classic league like J R R Tolkien. Do not think that I'm doing that. What I am saying is a significant difference. And also, along this topic, there are many potentates, pundits, influencers, what have you, booktuber people. I mean, it seems like Daniel Green is the foremost one. Um, but many people seem to have adopted the same language. They call this the newer authors like modern fantasy or contemporary fantasy, and they call Tolkien classic fantasy. Or I have seen Brian Lee Durfee say something like, now this is not a dig on him actually, because he may have said this in a way like publishers just won't accept this, but it does make me angry. And it almost makes me angry that he has said this. But I mean, I'm not saying it's not a dig because I can't be sure, because don't know his motivation. It's not here to explain it. But they say things like, well, you just can't write that way. You can't write with lyricism. And that's ridiculous too. And I made that clear in my first video, I think, which was a review of George R. R. Martin. But we shouldn't be furthering. What I'm saying is, we should not be furthering decline in quality, decline in art, and a decline in following examples. And a lot of reaction to Tolkien has been called sort of like the Tolkien clone, they call it, era. It's been like, well, that era just copied Tolkien, and like we're better now because we're not doing that. I don't want that has become in some ways like an implication that we're evolving better than the classics style. I guess we're going to call Tolkien the classic style. We're evolving better than this. I don't think we are evolving better than this. That's the point of this video. I don't think we've evolved better. I think we've gotten away from artistic and intellectual expression. We've gotten away from the intellectual also fundaments and the intellectual rigor and intellectual authenticity of doing it. And they've talked about what they're doing like they're forces of the market. This is not what we should be doing.